Sandra swallowed hard. She knew this would be difficult, but she had hoped, even prayed, that they would see David for who he was: a man of integrity, a man of substance. "Daddy, please," she whispered. "David is not a nobody. He is hardworking." Shut up. Madame Grace cut in, her voice shrill with fury. "Have you lost your mind, Sandra? After all the rich suitors that have been coming to ask for your hand in marriage, you bring this pauper to us." David remained silent, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening, but his eyes remained calm. "I am not a pauper," he said gently. "I may not be rich, but I—" "Oh, shut up, boy." Chief Martins barked, rising from his chair. "Who gave you permission to speak? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I have built in this community? And you think I would allow my daughter, my only daughter, to marry some useless dreamer?" Sandra felt the sting of tears in her eyes. "Daddy, David is studying law. He is one of the best in our department." "And what does that matter?" her mother spat. "Does he have money? Connections? Influence? Can he put food on the table?" Sandra's heart broke into pieces. She turned to her siblings, hoping for a shred of support, but all she saw was amusement on their faces. "Look at her, Emma," Vivian sneered. "Love has made her stupid." Emma chuckled. "She wants to go and suffer in poverty. Let her go. I give her 1 year before she comes crawling back, begging for food." Sandra's lips trembled. "Emma, Vivian, I am your sister. 3 questions that haunt the soul. What does it mean to be truly free? Is love a gift to be cherished or a curse to be silenced? And in a world where wealth commands respect, does a heart that beats for truth stand any chance? These are the questions that will unfold before your eyes in this gripping tale of love, betrayal, and unthinkable pain. Stay with us as we delve into the heart-wrenching journey of a young woman torn between the desires of her heart and the chains of her family's greed. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any updates on this powerful story. Also, share it with others so they, too, can learn from this tragic yet deeply moving experience. Now, let's begin. Sandra sat in the middle of the dimly lit living room, her heart pounding violently against her ribcage. Across from her, her father, Chief Martins, sat in his plush leather chair, staring at her with the cold intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Her mother, Madame Grace, perched beside him, her sharp gaze piercing through Sandra like a dagger. Sandra's younger siblings, Emma and Vivian, stood at the corner of the room, their arms crossed, smirking as if they already knew how this was going to end. And at the center of this storm, standing beside Sandra, was David, the man she had dared to love. David was everything Sandra had ever wanted in a man. He was gentle, wise, and deeply spiritual. His faith in God was unshakable, and his dreams were bigger than his background. He was her course mate at the university, the only one who could challenge her intellectually and spiritually. They had spent hours discussing the meaning of life, faith, and purpose. He was her safe haven, her best friend, her heart. But to her parents, he was nothing. Less than nothing. "Let me get this straight," Chief Martins finally spoke, his voice slow and dangerously low. "You brought this," he pointed at David as if he were an object, "into my house and expect me to give you my blessing? This nobody? This commoner?" Sandra swallowed hard. She knew this would be difficult, but she had hoped, even prayed, that they would see David for who he was: a man of integrity, a man of substance. "Daddy, please," she whispered. "David is not a nobody. He is hardworking." Shut up. Madame Grace cut in, her voice shrill with fury. "Have you lost your mind, Sandra? After all the rich suitors that have been coming to ask for your hand in marriage, you bring this pauper to us." David remained silent, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening, but his eyes remained calm. "I am not a pauper," he said gently. "I may not be rich, but I—" "Oh, shut up, boy." Chief Martins barked, rising from his chair. "Who gave you permission to speak? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I have built in this community? And you think I would allow my daughter, my only daughter, to marry some useless dreamer?" Sandra felt the sting of tears in her eyes. "Daddy, David is studying law. He is one of the best in our department." "And what does that matter?" her mother spat. "Does he have money? Connections? Influence? Can he put food on the table?" Sandra's heart broke into pieces. She turned to her siblings, hoping for a shred of support, but all she saw was amusement on their faces. "Look at her, Emma," Vivian sneered. "Love has made her stupid." Emma chuckled. "She wants to go and suffer in poverty. Let her go. I give her 1 year before she comes crawling back, begging for food." Sandra's lips trembled. Emma Vivian, I am your sister. Emma scoffed. Sister? Please. If you marry this man, you are no longer our sister. Sandra gasped. You can't mean that. We do, Vivian said with finality. Sandra turned back to her parents. Daddy, Mummy, please, I love him. Chief Martins folded his arms. Love doesn't pay bills, Sandra. You will marry Chief Williams, and that is final. A shiver ran down Sandra's spine. Chief Williams. A man old enough to be her father. A man she had never met, but whom her parents had arranged for her to marry because of his vast wealth and political influence. She shook her head violently. No. I won't. Madame Grace's hand came down hard across Sandra's face. The slap was deafening. Sandra stumbled back, her cheek burning, tears blinding her vision. You will do as you're told, her mother hissed. And then, before she could react, her father spoke the words that shattered her soul completely. If you choose this boy, Sandra, you are dead to us. A cold wave of horror washed over her. She turned to David, who was staring at her with pain in his eyes, guilt written all over his face. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the question that would change her life forever. What do we do now? David exhaled and reached for her hand. We fight. What happens next? Will Sandra stand her ground, or will she cave under pressure? Will David prove himself against all odds, or will their love crumble in the face of persecution? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. And please, share this story with others, it might just change someone's life. What do you think Sandra should do? Let us know in the comments below. Sandra sat across from David in the small cafeteria outside the church premises, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched glass of water. The burden on her heart felt heavier than ever. Their love was already being strangled by her parents' greed, but now, she had another idea, one last flicker of hope. David, she said softly, breaking the silence between them. Yes, love? I want us to take this to the church marriage committee. David's eyes flickered with uncertainty. The marriage committee? Sandra nodded. Yes. Maybe if we have their blessing, my parents will reconsider. They respect the church. David exhaled deeply. He had a strange feeling about this, but if Sandra wanted it, he would try. All right, he said at last. Let's go. The following Sunday, David and Sandra sat nervously in the boardroom of the church, facing 5 elders from the marriage committee. These were men and women of great influence in the church, people who were supposed to provide spiritual guidance and support for young couples. Elder Jonah, the chairman of the committee, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Brother David, Sister Sandra, we have received your request to seek approval for courtship leading to marriage. David nodded. Yes, sir. We love each other and desire to do things the right way. A long, uncomfortable silence followed. Then, Elder Jonah leaned forward. So let me get this straight. You have already fallen in love, made up your minds, and now you bring it to us. David blinked. Sir? Another elder, Elder Agnes, shook her head in disappointment. Young man, do you even understand what spiritual authority means? You only came to us to rubber-stamp your decision, not to receive guidance or counsel. Sandra's heart pounded. No, Ma, that's not it. We came because we honor. Silence. Elder Jonah's voice boomed. This is the problem with young people today. You act first and seek wisdom later. David's hands clenched under the table, but he forced himself to remain calm. Sir, with all due respect, I am a man of prayer. I sought God before approaching Sandra. And yet, you did not seek the church, Elder Agnes cut in sharply. That is rebellion, Brother David. Sandra felt her stomach churn. But, isn't marriage a personal decision? Shouldn't 2 people seek God first before involving others? Elder Jonah scoffed. Sister Sandra, you are still a child in the faith. You don't know what is best for you. Sandra swallowed the lump in her throat. So you disapprove of us? Elder Jonah leaned back in his chair. It is not just about our approval, Sister Sandra. Someone else has already approached us for you. Sandra's breath hitched. What? David turned sharply to the elders. What do you mean? Elder Agnes smiled strange, knowing smile. Brother Emmanuel has already declared his intentions to the committee, long before you even thought of coming here. Sandra's eyes widened. Brother Emmanuel? Yes. A man of good reputation. A strong financial background. A well-respected leader in the church. Sandra shook her head in disbelief. But I don't even know him personally. Elder Jonah dismissed her words with a wave of his hand. That is irrelevant. He is a good match for you. Sandra's voice rose, her emotions spiraling. You are telling me to love a stranger? Elder Agnes frowned. Love grows, my dear. Do you think our parents married for love? Sandra felt her world spin. But this is my life. I can't give my heart to someone I don't know. David, who had remained silent, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was steel in his tone. So, let me understand this correctly. The church did not reject me because I am unfit. You rejected me because someone better, someone richer has already claimed her? Elder Jonah adjusted his glasses, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Brother David, this is not about wealth. David tilted his head. Then what is it about? Because from where I sit, it sounds like politics, not spirituality. Silence. For the first time, the committee looked unsettled. Sandra rose to her feet, her heart pounding. I gave Brother Emmanuel an answer already. I told him no. Elder Agnes scoffed. That was your mistake, Sister Sandra. If you were wise, you would have sought counsel first. Sandra shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. So my feelings don't matter? My happiness is irrelevant. Elder Jonah sighed. Marriage is not about happiness. It is about purpose. Sandra's voice cracked. And who decides my purpose? You? Elder Agnes folded her arms. We have spoken, Sister Sandra. You are not permitted to marry Brother David. David stood slowly, his eyes dark with emotion. And if she refuses? Elder Jonah's gaze turned cold. Then she will be counted among those who rebelled against spiritual authority. Sandra's body trembled. The rejection from her parents had been painful. But this? This was a dagger through her soul. David took her hand in his, squeezing it firmly. The message was clear. They were on their own. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Sandra and David sat in tense silence as the church elders whispered among themselves. The mood in the boardroom had grown colder, and a creeping sense of dread wrapped itself around them. Sandra's heart pounded. She had never imagined that the place she considered a refuge, a sanctuary, would turn into a battlefield. Elder Jonah finally cleared his throat, his voice sharp and unyielding. Sandra. David. It is clear that you both remain stubborn in your rebellion. David clenched his jaw. Rebellion? Elder Agnes nodded, folding her arms. Yes. You have disregarded the spiritual authority placed over you. You refuse to accept the wise counsel of the marriage committee. Instead, you pursue your own desires. Sandra's fingers dug into her lap. How is it rebellion to want to marry the one I love? Elder Jonah shook his head. Love? My dear, what you call love is nothing but fleshly infatuation. If it were truly God's will, you would have sought counsel first, not after setting your hearts on each other. David exhaled sharply. You mean like Brother Emmanuel did? A heavy silence followed. Elder Agnes' lips pursed. Brother Emmanuel followed the due process. Sandra couldn't take it anymore. So, because he followed your process, it doesn't matter how I feel? It doesn't matter that I don't know him. Elder Jonah's voice was grave. Sandra, we are deeply disappointed in you. David sat forward, his voice filled with controlled anger. With all due respect, sir, if this is truly about guidance, why is the committee arranging marriages instead of letting people seek God for themselves? Elder Agnes' face darkened. Be careful, Brother David. That sounds dangerously like questioning authority. David scoffed. And what authority is that? The authority to play matchmaker instead of shepherds. A tense silence filled the room. Then Elder Jonah's voice cut through the air like a knife. Since you have refused to submit, the church will take action. Sandra's breath hitched. What do you mean? Elder Jonah's eyes were cold. Effective immediately, if you persist in this rebellion, you will be excommunicated from this church. Sandra's body went numb. David sat still, his muscles tensed, as if trying to restrain his rage. Excommunicated? Sandra whispered. Yes, Elder Agnes confirmed. You will no longer be permitted to hold any position in the church. You will no longer be counted among us. Your names will be blotted out from the membership register. Sandra's hands trembled. All because I won't marry the man you chose for me? Elder Jonah's tone was final. Because you refused to obey. David stood up suddenly. So this is the church's way of punishing those who don't fall in line? Elder Jonah's gaze darkened. This is our way of upholding order, young man. Sandra could hardly breathe. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, the door opened. The general pastor walked in. Sandra's heart leaped with hope. Maybe he had heard everything. Maybe he had come to correct this injustice. The general pastor, a tall, imposing man with a quiet authority, took a seat at the head of the table. He steepled his fingers and looked at them both with an expression Sandra couldn't quite read. "I have heard much about this matter," he said finally. Sandra nodded, her lips trembling. "Pastor, please." He raised a hand, and she fell silent. "I have received several reports about this committee," he continued. "Many complaints. Concerns that they have gone beyond their duty and have used their office to manipulate marriages rather than guide them." Sandra's heart lifted slightly. Elder Jonah shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, that is an exaggeration." The general pastor looked at him sharply. "Is it?" There was a long silence. Then he turned back to Sandra and David. "Nevertheless," he continued, his voice now firm, "I stand with the committee's decision." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. David's hands clenched into fists. "Sir?" The pastor exhaled. "We must uphold order. If we begin to let members challenge authority, there will be chaos." Sandra felt like the floor had been pulled from beneath her. David's voice was dangerously low. "So even after acknowledging the complaints, you will still let them get away with this?" The general pastor sighed. "Brother David, my hands are tied." Sandra's stomach twisted in horror. Elder Jonah smirked. Elder Agnes smiled. And that was the moment Sandra realized they had won. The next day, David received a message from the church office. The church had written an official letter to Sandra's family, a letter informing them that the church itself disapproved of their relationship. Sandra's parents had been furious before. But now? Now, they were empowered by the church's rejection. Sandra sat on the edge of David's bed in his small apartment, tears streaming down her face. David stood by the window, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "It wasn't just your parents," he murmured. Sandra sniffled, wiping her eyes. "What?" David turned, his eyes filled with pain. "It wasn't just your parents who betrayed us." Sandra nodded slowly, feeling the unbearable weight of it all. "It was the church." David sat beside her, taking her hand in his. For the first time, there were tears in his eyes too. "We were ready to fight your family," he whispered. "But how do you fight a place that's supposed to protect you?" Sandra closed her eyes, her heart breaking in ways she never thought possible. "This isn't about just you and me anymore," she said softly. "It's about something much bigger." David nodded. And in that moment, they both knew. Something had changed forever. Within weeks, Sandra and David's case had become the hottest topic in the church. From the pulpit to the pews, from the choir stand to the ushering department, everyone had something to say. The once unified church was now a battlefield of whispers, debates, and silent fear. Some jealous brothers, those who had secretly admired Sandra from afar but had never dared approach her, were celebrating. "It serves them right," Brother Matthew sneered to his friends after service. "Sandra walks around like she's untouchable. Always carrying herself like a queen. Let's see how she likes being humbled." Brother Paul nodded in agreement. "David too, he thinks is too wise. Always quoting scripture and acting holier than thou. Well, he just met his match. Let him go and marry in another church if he wants." But while some were rejoicing in secret, others were deeply troubled. A more sensitive brother, Samuel, confided in his friend Michael after youth fellowship. "If they could do this to David, what happens to the rest of us?" Michael exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "That's what I've been thinking. Many of us have plans for marriage, some of us even have people in mind. But if we have to get approval before falling in love, how is that even realistic?" Sister Deborah, who had been listening nearby, leaned in. "And let's not pretend," she whispered. "There are many of us in secret courtships because we already know what the committee would say. If they find out, we could be next." A heavy silence fell between them. For the first time in years, fear gripped the church's youth arm. The church elders, sensing the growing unrest, became increasingly defensive. During the next Sunday service, Elder Jonah addressed the congregation directly. "We have seen many strange attitudes among the youth in recent weeks," he announced from the altar, his voice laced with warning. "Rebellious spirits. Questioning authority. Let me remind you all, this is God's house, and in this house, we follow divine order." Elder Agnes took the microphone next. "Some of you are sympathizing with lawbreakers," she said, her sharp gaze scanning the congregation. "But be careful. When Korah and his followers rebelled against Moses, did God not open the earth to swallow them? If you stand with rebels, you share in their punishment." A shiver ran through the congregation. But despite the threats, whispers continued. The church leaders were losing control. In the privacy of his office, the general pastor sat with his hands clasped, his face lined with worry. His wife, a deeply discerning woman, stood by the window, arms folded. "You don't look at peace, my husband." He sighed. "Because I am not." She turned to him. "Is it about Sandra and David?" He nodded. "This situation, it's dividing the church. And to make it worse, the youths are beginning to question our authority." His wife hesitated before speaking. "Do you think we handled it well?" The general pastor exhaled. "I don't know anymore. I've received too many complaints about the marriage committee's excesses. The way they handle things, the power they wield, something is not right." His wife gave him a long, knowing look. "Then why did you go along with their decision?" The pastor leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Because if I didn't, I would have been seen as undermining my own leadership." She sat down beside him. "So you let two innocent people suffer to maintain your image?" The general pastor had no answer. By the following Sunday, the church was officially divided. The youth wing, full of university students exposed to other perspectives, became the biggest threat to the system. Many of them had friends in other denominations' churches where young people were encouraged to choose their partners in love and prayer, not under strict committee control. A few outspoken ones started asking dangerous questions. "If God is the one who leads people to their life partners," Brother Samuel asked during youth Bible study, "why does the church act as if it must approve of God's choice first?" Another brother, Michael, added, "And if the marriage committee always picks the right spouse, how come there are so many unhappy marriages in this church?" Sister Deborah chimed in, "And why do some committee members make secret promises to people? I know a sister who was told that if she behaved well, the elders would give her a good brother in marriage." Gasps rippled through the room. The foundation of the system was being shaken. Sandra and David were no longer just a couple in crisis. They had become symbols of something bigger. And the whole church was on the edge of a storm. David arrived at Sandra's hostel with a familiar sense of urgency. He had come to help her with her final year project, something they had been working on together for weeks. But the moment he saw the distant look in her eyes, he knew something was wrong. "Sandra?" He set his bag down and sat beside her on the hostel balcony, where she had been staring into the sky, lost in thought. She exhaled deeply before turning to him. "David, I don't know if we're supposed to be together anymore." David's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before speaking, as if struggling to put her thoughts into words. "If God is truly with us, why is all this happening?" David said nothing, letting her continue. "My parents hate you. The church has rejected us. Even the entire congregation is divided because of us. Shouldn't God's will come with peace? If we were truly meant for each other, why all this controversy? Why all this persecution?" She swallowed hard. Maybe God is trying to tell us something. Maybe he's telling us we're not meant to be." David studied her carefully. He could see the turmoil in her eyes. The fear. The exhaustion. The weight of everything pressing down on her. He took a deep breath. Then he began. "Sandra," he said gently, "do you remember what Jesus told his disciples in John 16 verse 33? Sandra furrowed her brows, still shaken. "What does it say?" David leaned forward. "Jesus said, 'In this world, you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world.'" She nodded slowly. David continued, his voice steady. "Persecution is not a sign that God is absent. In fact, it is often a sign that you are on the right path. Look at the prophets. Jeremiah was thrown into a pit. Daniel was thrown into a lion's den. The apostles were beaten, imprisoned, even killed. Did that mean they were outside of God's will?" Sandra swallowed, remaining silent. David's tone grew firmer. "I am studying to become a barrister, Sandra. And one of the first things we learn in law is this: the truth is always tested. It is tested in court. It is tested in cross-examinations. It is tested by opposing arguments. The strength of a case is not in how easy it goes, but in how well it stands against attack." Sandra looked at him, intrigued. "In the same way, love is tested. Faith is tested. Convictions are tested." He paused before continuing. "When gold is refined, it is put through fire to remove impurities. When a tree is deeply rooted, the wind must try to shake it. And when God establishes something, whether a calling, a faith, or even a relationship, he allows it to be challenged to see if it can stand." Sandra's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. David pressed on. "Did you think the devil would fold his hands and watch us walk into a godly, purpose-driven marriage without resistance? Look at Adam and Eve. Their union was barely days old before Satan showed up." Sandra blinked. David's voice softened, but his words were even more piercing. Tell me, Sandra, if God's will always meant an easy path, why did Jesus have to carry a cross? She inhaled sharply. David's eyes bore into hers. You asked why this is happening. I will tell you why. Because God's best always faces opposition. Because every great move of God must first survive fire. And because the enemy will do everything in his power to break us apart before we even begin. Sandra lowered her gaze, visibly shaken. David continued, gentler now. You say you are no longer sure if God is with us. But tell me, what is a better sign of God's presence, the absence of problems or the grace to overcome them? Sandra's breathing had slowed. David leaned closer. Do you know what scares me the most? Not persecution. Not opposition. What scares me is the idea that you would let them win. That after all this, after everything we've prayed about, everything we've shared, you would look at the storm and decide that God is not with us. Sandra's hands were trembling. David reached for her gently. Sandra, God does not lead by confusion. If he was never in this, he would have stopped it at the beginning. He wouldn't have let our paths cross the way they did. He wouldn't have given us peace when we prayed. He wouldn't have let our hearts connect in the way they have. Sandra bit her lower lip, eyes brimming with tears. David's voice dropped to a whisper. Don't let fear make you throw away what God gave you. A single tear slipped down Sandra's cheek. She opened her mouth to speak but found that she had no words. For the first time in days, her heart was still. She had come into this conversation filled with doubt. Now, sitting before her was a man of wisdom. A man of faith. A man who saw beyond the storm. David hadn't just given her an answer. He had given her the truth. And she could not deny it. What will Sandra do now? Will she still walk away, or will she stand strong with David? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. See you in the next episode.